The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Clarence's house as Prince William walked briskly down the marble corridor. His footsteps echoed against the polished floors, creating a rhythmic sound that matched his determined pace. The prince had received an urgent message from his private secretary about a situation that required immediate attention. Though the details remained frustratingly vague, William had been looking forward to a quiet morning reviewing his upcoming charitable engagements when the call came. The voice on the other end had been carefully neutral, but he could detect an underlying tension that suggested something significant had occurred. As the future king, William had learned to read between the lines of diplomatic language. And today those skills were telling him to prepare for something unpleasant. The prince paused outside the drawing-room doors, straightening his navy blazer and taking a deep breath. Through the ornate wooden doors, he could hear muffled voices engaged in what sounded like an intense discussion. One voice he immediately recognized as belonging to Camilla, the queen consort, while the other belonged to Lady Margaret Thornfield, a senior lady-in-waiting. Who had served the royal family for over 2 decades. William had always maintained a cordial relationship with Camilla, understanding the complexities of her position within the family structure. However, recent months had brought subtle changes in the dynamics at court. Various staff members had approached him with concerns about certain incidents, though none had been willing to speak openly about specific details until now. As he approached the door, William caught fragments of the conversation taking place inside. Camilla's voice carried a sharp edge that he rarely heard in public settings. She was discussing arrangements for an upcoming state dinner, but her tone suggested frustration with someone's performance or suggestions. "The arrangements are simply inadequate," Camilla was saying, her voice rising slightly. "I specifically requested that the seating chart reflect proper protocol, and what I received was amateur work that would embarrass us in front of foreign dignitaries." Lady Margaret's response was measured but firm. "Your Majesty, the arrangements follow the established precedent for such events. The Protocol Office has reviewed everything twice to ensure accuracy." "Don't lecture me about protocol," Camilla snapped back. "I've been managing these events successfully while others were still learning basic etiquette. Perhaps the problem isn't with the arrangements, but with people who lack the experience to execute them properly." William frowned at the harsh tone. He had worked closely with Lady Margaret on numerous occasions and knew her to be exceptionally competent and dedicated. The criticism seemed unfair and unnecessarily personal. The conversation continued with increasing tension. Camilla's voice grew more cutting as she criticized various aspects of the planning process. "Furthermore, I'm concerned about the staff's ability to handle the complexities of modern royal events. Some members of this household seem to confuse enthusiasm with actual competence." "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret replied, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious pressure, "I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the scope of the current arrangements. Perhaps we could review the specific concerns point by point." "Misunderstanding?" Camilla's voice turned icy. "The misunderstanding, my dear, is thinking that good intentions can substitute for actual capability. I've seen too many well-meaning people create disasters while believing they're being helpful." William's jaw tightened as he listened to the exchange. The personal nature of the attack was becoming increasingly clear, and he could hear the hurt in Lady Margaret's voice despite her professional composure. This wasn't merely about event planning. It seemed to be part of a larger pattern of behavior that had been concerning various staff members. The prince knew he needed to intervene before the situation escalated further. Lady Margaret had been a trusted advisor to multiple generations of the royal family, and her expertise was invaluable. More importantly, she deserved to be treated with respect regardless of any disagreements about protocol or planning. He knocked firmly on the door before entering, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the room. Both women turned toward him, their expressions revealing the tension that had been building during their private conversation. "Good morning," William said, his voice carefully controlled as he assessed the situation. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything urgent." Camilla quickly composed herself, switching to the gracious public persona that she had perfected over the years. William, how lovely to see you. Lady Margaret and I were just discussing the arrangements for next week's state dinner. Lady Margaret offered a slight curtsy, her face pale but her demeanor remaining professional. Your Royal Highness, we were reviewing the protocol requirements for the upcoming event. William studied both women carefully, noting the subtle signs of stress and conflict that couldn't be completely hidden. As someone who had spent his entire life navigating the complex relationships within the royal household, he could sense when diplomatic language was being used to cover deeper problems. I trust everything is progressing smoothly, he said, though his tone suggested he suspected otherwise. The state dinner is certainly an important event, and I know how much effort goes into ensuring everything meets our standards. The room fell silent for a moment as both women seemed to weigh their responses carefully. William's presence had clearly interrupted something significant, and the carefully maintained facades were beginning to show cracks. Camilla was the first to break the silence. Of course, William. Though I must say, coordinating these complex events requires a level of experience and understanding that not everyone possesses. It's crucial that we maintain the highest standards. The comment, while seemingly innocent, carried an unmistakable implication about Lady Margaret's capabilities. William's expression hardened slightly as he recognized the subtle attack disguised as general commentary about standards. Lady Margaret remained silent, but William could see the impact of the words in her posture and expression. The situation was clearly more serious than a simple disagreement about dinner arrangements, and he realized that immediate action would be necessary to address what appeared to be a pattern of inappropriate behavior. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the windows, but the atmosphere in the room had grown considerably darker as the true nature of the conflict began to emerge. William decided to address the situation directly rather than allowing the uncomfortable atmosphere to continue. He had learned from his father that sometimes royal diplomacy required setting aside pleasantries in favor of honest communication, especially when the welfare of dedicated staff members was at stake. Lady Margaret, he said, turning toward the experienced courtier, would you mind giving us a moment? I'd like to discuss some aspects of the upcoming schedule with Camilla privately. Lady Margaret looked relieved at the opportunity to leave the tense situation. Of course, Your Royal Highness. I'll be in my office reviewing the final details should you need anything further. She gathered her papers and departed with as much dignity as she could muster. Though William noticed her hands were slightly trembling once the door closed behind Lady Margaret, William turned his full attention to Camilla. The Queen Consort was arranging some flowers in a crystal vase, her movements deliberate and controlled, but he could sense the defensiveness in her posture. That seemed like quite an intense discussion, William observed, his tone neutral but probing. Lady Margaret appeared rather upset when I arrived. Camilla continued her flower arranging without looking up. Oh, you know how these planning sessions can be? Everyone has their own ideas about how things should be done. Sometimes it takes firm guidance to ensure everything meets the proper standards. William moved closer to where she was working, his presence making it clear that he expected a more substantial explanation. Firm guidance is one thing, but I couldn't help overhearing some of the conversation. The tone seemed rather personal for a discussion about dinner arrangements. For the first time since he'd entered the room, Camilla looked directly at him. Her eyes flashed with a mixture of surprise and annoyance that someone had been listening to what she clearly thought was a private conversation. William, I hardly think it's appropriate for you to be monitoring my conversations with staff members. I'm perfectly capable of managing household affairs without supervision. The prince felt his patience beginning to wear thin. I wasn't monitoring anything. I arrived for a scheduled meeting and couldn't help but notice that a respected member of our staff was being subjected to what sounded like personal attacks rather than professional feedback. Camilla set down the flower she had been holding and turned to face him fully. Personal attacks? I was simply expressing my expectations for the quality of work that this household requires. If Lady Margaret found that uncomfortable, perhaps she needs to examine whether her current role is still suitable for her. William felt a surge of anger at the dismissive tone and the implicit threat to Lady Margaret's position. The lady-in-waiting had served his family with distinction for decades, and deserved better treatment than she was apparently receiving. Lady Margaret has been an invaluable member of this household long before either of us held our current positions, he said firmly. Her experience and dedication have been instrumental in maintaining the standards you're so concerned about. Experience from a different era, Camilla replied coolly. The requirements of modern royal events have evolved considerably. What worked 20 years ago may not be adequate for today's challenges. William recognized the argument as a deflection from the real issue. This isn't about modernizing procedures. What I overheard was criticism that seemed designed to undermine rather than improve. There's a difference between constructive feedback and creating a hostile work environment. Camilla's composure slipped slightly at the accusation. I resent the implication that I create hostile work environments. I have always maintained professional relationships with staff members while ensuring they understand the expectations of their positions. Professional relationships don't typically involve questioning someone's basic competence or suggesting they lack the ability to do their job properly, William countered. Lady Margaret looked genuinely distressed when I entered the room. The Queen Consort moved away from the flower arrangement and walked toward the window, her back to William as she gazed out at the gardens. Perhaps Lady Margaret is simply feeling the pressure of maintaining relevance in a changing institution. Change can be difficult for people who have become comfortable with old ways of doing things. William followed her to the window, determined not to let her avoid the conversation. This has nothing to do with resistance to change and everything to do with basic respect. Lady Margaret has adapted to every transition this family has undergone while maintaining the highest standards of service. And yet, Camilla said, turning back toward him with a challenging expression, the arrangements she presented today were filled with errors that would have embarrassed us in front of international guests. Someone needs to address these issues before they become public problems. What specific errors? William asked pointedly. Because from what I heard, you were criticizing her general competence rather than addressing particular mistakes. Camilla hesitated for a moment before responding, suggesting that her accusations might not have been as well-founded as she had implied. The seating arrangements didn't properly reflect the diplomatic protocols for the visiting delegation. The menu selections showed a lack of understanding of cultural preferences. Various details that someone with proper experience should have anticipated. William considered her response carefully. He had reviewed many of Lady Margaret's previous arrangements, and had always found them to be meticulously planned and culturally sensitive. I'd like to see these arrangements myself. If there are genuine issues, we can address them constructively without undermining a valuable staff member. I hardly think that's necessary, Camilla replied quickly. I'm perfectly capable of working with Lady Margaret to correct any problems. There's no need to escalate minor planning disagreements. The quick backtrack confirmed William's suspicion that the criticisms had been more about asserting authority than addressing legitimate concerns. If they're minor disagreements, then perhaps the conversation I overheard was an overreaction to manageable issues. Camilla's expression hardened as she realized that William wasn't going to accept her explanations without challenge. I think you may have misinterpreted what you heard. Staff management requires clear communication of expectations, which can sometimes sound harsh to outside observers. William shook his head. What I heard wasn't clear communication of expectations. It was personal criticism designed to make someone feel inadequate about their abilities. There's an important distinction between the two approaches. The tension in the room continued to build as both parties held their ground. William was determined to protect a valued staff member from unfair treatment, while Camilla seemed equally determined to maintain her authority over household management decisions. Perhaps, Camilla said finally, her voice taking on a sharp edge, you should focus on your own responsibilities rather than micromanaging how others handle theirs. I have been managing royal households successfully. while you were still learning basic protocol. The comment struck William as both inappropriate and revealing about the underlying dynamics at play in the confrontation. William felt the full weight of Camilla's dismissive comment settle between them like a challenge thrown down in the elegant drawing room. The suggestion that he should stay out of household management, and her pointed reference to his earlier learning years revealed an attitude that went far beyond the immediate situation with Lady Margaret. "I think you've misunderstood the nature of my concern," William said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had inherited from generations of royal leadership. "This isn't about micromanaging or territorial disputes over household responsibilities. This is about ensuring that everyone who serves this family is treated with the respect they deserve." Camilla crossed her arms and moved back toward the center of the room, her posture becoming more defensive. "Respect is earned through competent performance, William. I can't be expected to lower standards just to protect someone's feelings." "No one is asking you to lower standards," William replied firmly. "But there's a difference between maintaining high expectations and creating an atmosphere where valued staff members feel attacked and undermined. What I witnessed when I arrived suggested the latter." The Queen Consort picked up a crystal paperweight from a nearby table and turned it over in her hands, the morning light catching its faceted surface. "I've been part of this family long enough to understand what's required to maintain our reputation. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions about personnel and performance." William studied her carefully, recognizing the deflection technique, but refusing to be drawn away from the central issue. "Lady Margaret's performance has been exemplary for over 20 years. If you have specific concerns about her work, they should be addressed through proper channels with documented issues, not through public humiliation disguised as feedback." "Public humiliation?" Camilla's voice rose slightly. "We were having a private conversation about work arrangements." If she felt uncomfortable with honest feedback, perhaps that says something about her ability to handle the pressures of her position. The prince felt his frustration mounting at what seemed like a deliberate mischaracterization of the situation. "What I overheard wasn't honest feedback about specific work issues. It was personal criticism designed to make someone question their basic competence. There's a significant difference between the two approaches." Camilla set down the paperweight with more force than necessary, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. "I find it interesting that you're so quick to question my judgment based on a few overheard comments. Perhaps you should consider whether your interpretation of the situation is accurate before making accusations." William moved closer, his expression serious. "My interpretation is based on Lady Margaret's obvious distress and your own words, which I heard clearly. Questioning someone's experience and competence in the way you did creates exactly the kind of workplace atmosphere we should be avoiding. And what exactly do you propose I do differently?" Camilla asked, her tone becoming increasingly challenging. "Should I pretend that mistakes don't matter? Should I avoid giving feedback entirely to protect everyone's feelings?" "You should provide constructive criticism that focuses on specific issues rather than personal attacks on someone's general abilities," William replied without hesitation. "You should treat long-serving staff members with the respect their dedication has earned. And you should remember that leadership involves building people up rather than tearing them down." Camilla's expression grew cold at what she clearly perceived as a lecture about leadership from someone she considered less experienced in royal household management. "I hardly need lessons in leadership from someone who has never had to manage the complexities of running a major royal residence." William felt a flash of anger at the condescending response. "I may not have managed a royal residence in the same way you have, but I've spent my entire life learning about effective leadership from multiple perspectives. What I learned is that true authority comes from earning respect, not demanding it through intimidation." "Intimidation?" Camilla laughed sharply. "You're being dramatic, William. This is about maintaining standards and ensuring competent performance. If that makes some people uncomfortable, perhaps they're not suited for positions that require resilience and adaptability." The prince shook his head in frustration. "You're missing the point entirely. This isn't about people being too sensitive or lacking resilience. It's about the difference between challenging people to excel and making them feel worthless. Lady Margaret has demonstrated both resilience and adaptability throughout multiple transitions in this family. Camilla walked toward the fireplace, where family photographs lined the mantelpiece. She picked up one of the frames and studied it for a moment before turning back to face William.
Perhaps the real issue here is that you're uncomfortable with anyone other than your immediate family having authority over household operations.
William stared at her in disbelief. This has nothing to do with family dynamics or authority structures. This is about basic human decency and professional respect. I would have the same reaction regardless of who was treating a staff member inappropriately. Would you? Camilla challenged. Or is this really about asserting your own influence over how things are done? You've made it clear that you disagree with my approach, but that doesn't make your way automatically superior. The accusation struck William as particularly unfair given the circumstances. My concern is protecting someone who has served this family loyally for decades from treatment that no one should have to endure in their workplace. If you can't see the difference between that and a power struggle, then perhaps we have a more serious problem than I initially realized. Camilla replaced the photograph on the mantelpiece and turned to face him directly. What exactly are you suggesting, William? That I'm unfit to manage household affairs? That my approach to staff management is fundamentally flawed? William took a deep breath, recognizing that the conversation had reached a critical juncture. I'm suggesting that what I witnessed today was inappropriate and that it represents a pattern of behavior that needs to change. Lady Margaret isn't the only staff member who has expressed concerns about the current atmosphere in certain parts of the household. The revelation that other staff members had raised similar concerns clearly surprised Camilla. Her expression shifted from defensive anger to something approaching alarm as she realized the scope of the issue William was addressing. Other staff members? She asked, her voice becoming more guarded. What exactly have they said? William recognized that he had reached the point where diplomatic language would no longer be sufficient. The situation required direct communication about serious workplace issues that could no longer be ignored or minimized. They've described feeling constantly criticized and undermined, he said quietly. They've talked about an atmosphere where everyone feels they're walking on eggshells, afraid of making minor mistakes that will result in personal attacks rather than constructive guidance. The silence that followed his words was heavy with implication and consequence. The silence stretched between them as Camilla processed William's revelation about multiple staff concerns. Her face cycled through various emotions, surprise, denial, and finally a defensive anger that seemed to harden her resolve rather than encourage self-reflection. I find it remarkable, she said finally, her voice taking on a coldly controlled tone, that staff members would feel comfortable going behind my back to complain rather than addressing their concerns directly with me. It suggests a lack of professionalism that confirms some of my observations about current personnel. William stared at her in disbelief. Even when confronted with evidence that her behavior was creating serious workplace problems, Camilla was choosing to blame the victims rather than examine her own actions. They haven't gone behind your back. They've sought guidance from family members because they feel unable to address these issues directly without fear of retaliation. Retaliation? Camilla's voice rose with indignation. I have never retaliated against anyone for expressing legitimate concerns about their work environment. The fact that they would characterize normal management oversight as retaliation suggests they may not be suited for positions that require accountability. The prince felt his patience finally reaching its breaking point. Normal management oversight doesn't involve questioning people's basic competence or making them feel worthless for minor mistakes. What you're describing as accountability sounds more like creating fear and insecurity among people who are trying to do their jobs well. Camilla moved toward the window again, her movements sharp with frustrated energy. Perhaps the problem isn't my approach, but rather a generation of staff members who expect constant validation rather than honest feedback about their performance. The royal household has always demanded excellence. Excellence has always been the standard, William agreed firmly. But it has traditionally been achieved through guidance and support, not through intimidation and personal attacks. Some of our most successful staff members have thrived for decades because they felt valued and respected while being challenged to do their best work, and some of our most serious problems have occurred when standards were allowed to slip because everyone was too concerned about hurting feelings, Camilla countered. I prefer to address issues directly rather than allowing them to fester until they become public embarrassments. William shook his head. Addressing issues directly doesn't require destroying someone's confidence or questioning their basic abilities. You can maintain high standards while still treating people with dignity and respect. Camilla turned from the window with an expression that suggested she was preparing to escalate the confrontation. I think you may be confusing effective management with social work, William. This household requires efficient operation, not group therapy sessions for staff members who find honest feedback challenging. The dismissive comment about group therapy revealed an attitude toward staff welfare that William found deeply troubling. Caring about the people who make our work possible isn't social work, it's good leadership. Happy, confident staff members consistently outperform those who are constantly worried about being criticized or replaced. Perhaps in theory, Camilla replied coolly. But in practice, some people perform better when they understand that their positions depend on meeting specific standards. A little healthy concern about job security can be quite motivating. William felt a surge of anger at what amounted to an admission that she was deliberately creating anxiety among staff members as a management technique. Using fear as a motivation tool isn't effective leadership, it's workplace bullying. People who are afraid of making mistakes often become less creative and less willing to take initiative. Camilla's expression grew icy at the accusation of bullying. I resent the characterization of professional expectations as bullying. If holding people accountable for their performance constitutes bullying in your opinion, then perhaps you should reconsider your understanding of what leadership requires. Professional expectations involve clear goals and constructive feedback, William replied firmly. What I witnessed today was personal criticism designed to undermine someone's confidence rather than improve their performance. There's a fundamental difference between the two approaches. The Queen Consort picked up her handbag from a nearby chair, her movement suggesting she was considering ending the conversation. I think we may have to agree to disagree about management styles, William. I believe in direct communication and clear standards, while you apparently prefer a more permissive approach. William stepped between her and the door, making it clear that he didn't consider the conversation finished. This isn't about permissive versus strict management. This is about the difference between building people up and tearing them down. Lady Margaret looked devastated when I arrived, not motivated or challenged. Perhaps Lady Margaret needs to develop thicker skin if she plans to continue working in a demanding environment, Camilla said sharply. Not everyone is suited for the pressures of royal service. The suggestion that Lady Margaret, who had successfully navigated decades of royal service, needed to develop thicker skin struck William as particularly offensive. Lady Margaret has demonstrated remarkable resilience throughout multiple family transitions and crises. If she was upset today, it wasn't because she lacks the ability to handle pressure. Camilla's patience seemed to be wearing as thin as William's. Then, perhaps she was upset because she realized that her work wasn't meeting current standards. Sometimes people need to confront uncomfortable truths about their performance. What uncomfortable truths? William demanded. You still haven't provided any specific examples of actual problems with her work. All I've heard are vague criticisms about competence and experience that sound more like personal opinions than factual assessments. For a moment, Camilla seemed at a loss for words, confirming William's suspicion that her criticism of Lady Margaret had been more about asserting authority than addressing legitimate work issues, the details of performance. Evaluations are between supervisors and staff members, she said finally. I'm not required to justify my management decisions to family members who aren't directly involved in household operations. William recognized the response as an attempt to avoid accountability by claiming supervisory privilege. When family members receive complaints from multiple staff members about a hostile work environment, it becomes everyone's concern. This isn't about interfering with your authority, it's about protecting people who serve this family from inappropriate treatment. Camilla's expression suggested she was becoming increasingly frustrated with William's refusal to accept her explanations. I think you may be overreacting to what amounts to normal workplace dynamics. Every organization has occasional disagreements between supervisors and staff members. This goes beyond occasional disagreements, William replied firmly. When multiple people describe feeling constantly criticized and undermined, it indicates a systemic problem that needs to be addressed rather than dismissed as normal workplace dynamics. The conversation had clearly reached an impasse, with neither party willing to concede ground on what had become a fundamental disagreement about leadership, respect, and the appropriate treatment of dedicated staff members. Camilla gathered her composure and prepared to make what appeared to be her final statement on the matter. Camilla straightened her shoulders and fixed William with a look that combined wounded dignity with steely determination. I think this conversation has gone quite far enough, William. You've made your opinions about my management approach abundantly clear, and I've explained my position. Perhaps it's time we both return to our respective responsibilities. William recognized the attempt to dismiss him and end the conversation on her terms. But he wasn't prepared to let the serious issues they'd been discussing simply fade away without resolution. This conversation isn't about opinions or management preferences. It's about ensuring that people who serve this family are treated appropriately. That's not something we can simply agree to disagree about. And what exactly do you propose as a solution? Camilla asked, her tone suggesting she didn't expect any practical answer to the concerns he'd raised. Should I submit my interactions with staff members for your approval? Should household management decisions be made by committee to ensure everyone's feelings are protected? The sarcastic suggestions revealed Camilla's fundamental misunderstanding of what William was requesting. I'm proposing that you treat staff members with basic respect and professionalism. I'm suggesting that criticism should be constructive rather than personal. Those aren't unreasonable expectations for any workplace. Camilla moved toward her handbag again, clearly signaling her intention to leave. I've been treating staff members professionally for years. If some people are uncomfortable with honest feedback about their performance, perhaps they should consider whether they're in the right positions. William stepped closer, his voice taking on a firmer tone. What I witnessed today wasn't honest feedback. It was a personal attack disguised as professional criticism. Lady Margaret has given decades of exceptional service to this family. She deserves better treatment than she received this morning. Lady Margaret received feedback about the quality of her work, Camilla replied coldly. If that feedback was uncomfortable for her, perhaps it's because she recognized the validity of my concerns about her recent performance. The continued deflection and blame-shifting finally pushed William beyond diplomatic patience. Stop trying to reframe this as a performance issue. What I heard was you questioning Lady Margaret's basic competence and suggesting she lacks the experience to do her job properly. That kind of personal criticism is inappropriate regardless of any actual work concerns. Camilla's facade of controlled politeness began to crack under the sustained pressure of William's confrontation. I find it remarkable that you feel qualified to lecture me about appropriate behavior when you're clearly taking sides, without knowing all the relevant facts about the situation. The relevant facts are what I heard with my own ears, William replied firmly. Lady Margaret was being subjected to personal criticism that went far beyond any legitimate work feedback. That's not acceptable regardless of what other factors might be involved. For the first time in the conversation, Camilla's composure slipped entirely. Her voice rose with genuine anger as she abandoned the careful diplomatic language she had been maintaining. You have no idea what it's like to manage complex household operations while dealing with staff members who resist every change and question every decision. Sometimes direct communication is the only way to get through to people who are comfortable with mediocrity. The outburst revealed attitudes that William found deeply troubling. Lady Margaret doesn't resist change or question decisions inappropriately. She's adapted to every transition this family has undergone while maintaining exceptional performance standards. Your characterization of her is completely unfair, is it? Camilla challenged, her anger now fully visible. Or is it possible that you're not aware of all the challenges involved in managing people who believe their long service entitles them to continued employment regardless of current performance levels? William felt his own anger rising at what amounted to a suggestion that Lady Margaret's decades of service should provide no protection from unfair treatment. Long service doesn't entitle anyone to continued employment, but it does entitle them to respectful treatment and fair evaluation of their actual performance rather than personal attacks. Camilla grabbed her handbag and moved toward the door, clearly intending to end the conversation through departure rather than resolution. I think this discussion has become unproductive, William. You've made your position clear and I've explained mine. Perhaps we should leave it at that? William moved to block her path to the door, making it clear that he wasn't prepared to let her simply walk away from the serious issues they'd been discussing. We can't leave it at that when staff members are being treated inappropriately. This conversation needs to result in changes, not just an exchange of opinions. Changes? Camilla's voice took on a dangerous edge. What kind of changes are you suggesting? That I should modify my approach to accommodate staff members who can't handle direct feedback? That standards should be lowered to protect people's feelings? I'm suggesting that you find ways to maintain high standards without destroying people's confidence or questioning their basic competence, William replied firmly. I'm suggesting that effective leadership involves building people up rather than tearing them down. Camilla set her handbag down with considerable force, the sound echoing in the elegant room. And I'm suggesting that you may not understand what real leadership requires when dealing with challenging personnel situations. Not every problem can be solved with gentle encouragement and positive reinforcement. William studied her carefully, recognizing that they had reached the crux of their fundamental disagreement about leadership and human dignity. Every problem can be addressed with respect and professionalism. There's never a justification for personal attacks or efforts to undermine someone's confidence. The Queen Consort's expression grew, increasingly cold as she realized that William wasn't going to be swayed by her arguments or intimidated by her anger. Perhaps we have different definitions of what constitutes a personal attack. What you characterize as inappropriate behavior, I consider necessary feedback about performance standards. Then your definition is wrong, William said bluntly, abandoning diplomatic language in favor of clear truth-telling. Personal attacks on someone's competence and experience are inappropriate in any workplace setting. The fact that you can't see the difference between constructive criticism and personal undermining is exactly the problem. The direct accusation that her judgment was wrong clearly struck Camilla as crossing a line that shouldn't have been crossed. Her next words carried a level of venom that surprised even William with its intensity. How dare you suggest that my judgment is wrong when you've never had to manage the complexities that I deal with daily? She snapped. You have no idea what it takes to maintain standards while dealing with people who believe their positions are guaranteed regardless of performance. The conversation had clearly moved beyond any possibility of diplomatic resolution into territory where fundamental differences about respect, leadership, and human dignity would require more drastic measures to address. William recognized that the conversation had deteriorated beyond any hope of immediate resolution, but he also understood that walking away would send the wrong message about the seriousness of the issues they'd been discussing. The protection of dedicated staff members required more than diplomatic exchanges that led nowhere. I think we've reached the point where continued discussion isn't going to resolve our differences, he said finally, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for official communications. However, the concerns I've raised about staff treatment are not going to disappear simply because we disagree about appropriate management approaches. Camilla's expression suggested she understood the implications of his formal tone but was prepared to continue the confrontation rather than seek compromise. And what exactly do you intend to do about these concerns? Override my authority in household management? Dictate how I should interact with staff members? William considered his response carefully, recognizing that his next words would likely determine the future dynamics of their relationship and the welfare of the staff members caught in the middle. I intend to ensure that everyone who serves this family is treated with appropriate respect and professionalism. If that requires formal intervention, then formal intervention will occur. The threat of formal intervention clearly surprised Camilla, who had perhaps expected the conversation to end with mutual frustration but no actual consequences for her behavior. Formal intervention? You're threatening to involve outside authorities in internal household management? I'm not threatening anything, William replied firmly. I'm stating that inappropriate treatment of staff members cannot continue regardless of who is responsible for it. Lady Margaret and others deserve protection from workplace harassment disguised as performance management. Camilla's face flushed with anger at the suggestion that her behavior constituted workplace harassment. Harassment? You're accusing me of harassment because I provided feedback about work performance? This is absolutely ridiculous, William. What I witnessed this morning went far beyond performance feedback, William said calmly. Personal attacks on someone's competence and experience, efforts to undermine their confidence, and threats to their job? Security based on subjective opinions rather than documented performance issues. Those behaviors constitute harassment in any workplace. The Queen Consort gathered herself for what appeared to be a final attempt to end the conversation on her terms. I think you've allowed your personal feelings about Lady Margaret to cloud your judgment about appropriate workplace dynamics. Perhaps you should consider whether your emotional involvement in this situation is preventing you from seeing it. Clearly, William felt a flash of anger at the suggestion that his concern for staff welfare represented emotional involvement rather than principled leadership. My judgment is based on what I heard and observed, not on personal feelings. Lady Margaret's distress was obvious. Your criticism was personal rather than professional. And multiple staff members have expressed similar concerns about the current workplace atmosphere. Multiple staff members who apparently feel comfortable circumventing proper channels to complain about their supervisors, Camilla replied sharply. That kind of behavior undermines the entire structure of household management and creates exactly the kind of workplace problems you claim to be concerned about. The continued blame shifting finally exhausted William's patience with diplomatic approaches to the problem. The proper channels have failed when staff members feel unable to address concerns directly because of fear of retaliation. When people seek guidance from family members, it's usually because normal workplace protections have broken down. Camilla picked up her handbag again and moved toward the door with clear determination to end the conversation. I think this discussion has accomplished everything it's going to accomplish, William. You've made your opinions clear, and I've explained my position. Perhaps we should both focus on our actual responsibilities, rather than continuing this unproductive argument. William stepped aside to allow her to reach the door but made it clear that her departure wouldn't end his commitment to addressing the issues they discussed. My responsibility includes ensuring that people who serve this family are treated appropriately. That responsibility doesn't end just because this conversation is over. Camilla paused at the door and turned back to face him one final time. And my responsibility includes maintaining the standards and efficiency that allow this household to function effectively. I won't allow those standards to be compromised by people who confuse kindness with competent management. The final exchange revealed the fundamental gulf between their approaches to leadership and human dignity that made any immediate resolution impossible. William recognized that protecting staff members would require actions beyond diplomatic conversation. After Camilla left, William remained in the drawing room for several minutes, contemplating the implications of what had just occurred. The conversation had confirmed his worst fears about the treatment certain staff members were receiving and had revealed attitudes about leadership that he found completely unacceptable. He walked to his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Lady Margaret, requesting a private meeting to discuss her experiences and concerns in detail. The second was to his private secretary, asking for information about formal procedures for addressing workplace harassment within royal households. Over the following days, William conducted discreet interviews with several staff members who had expressed concerns about their treatment. Their stories painted a consistent picture of an increasingly toxic work environment where dedicated employees felt constantly criticized and undermined rather than supported and valued. Armed with documented concerns from multiple sources, William requested a formal meeting with his father to discuss implementation of new policies designed to protect staff welfare and ensure appropriate workplace conduct. The protection of people who serve the royal family with dedication and professionalism had become a priority that could no longer be addressed through diplomatic conversations alone. Lady Margaret, meanwhile, found herself reassigned to work directly with William on several upcoming charitable events, where her expertise and experience were valued rather than questioned. Other staff members noticed the change and began to feel more confident about reporting inappropriate treatment they had been enduring in silence. The confrontation in the drawing room had been unpleasant and had strained family relationships, but it had also initiated changes that would ultimately create a more respectful and professional work environment for everyone who contributed to the royal family's ability to serve the public effectively. William learned that sometimes protecting people requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable confrontations, but that the welfare of dedicated staff members justifies whatever personal costs such protection might entail. Leadership, he concluded, sometimes means standing up to powerful people when they abuse their authority. Regardless of family dynamics or diplomatic considerations, the morning sunlight that had streamed through the windows during the confrontation eventually gave way to afternoon shadows. But the issues raised during that difficult conversation continued to resonate through policy changes designed to ensure that such situations would not be allowed to continue unchecked in the future.